They already knew the faces they feared. Germany, April 1945. Dawn arrived without color, spreading a pale gray light across a temporary American processing camp built beside an abandoned freight yard less than 15 miles from the Elbe River. Cold rain had fallen through the night, leaving shallow puddles that reflected rows of wooden barracks and strands of barbed wire glistening beneath the morning sky. 12 German women stood silently in formation, their damp coats heavy against their shoulders, their boots sinking slightly into soft earth with every careful shift of weight. None of them spoke above a whisper. Even breathing seemed louder than it should have been. Elsa Reinhardt kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground in front of her. 27 years old, she had once measured her mornings by hospital rounds, fresh bandages, and the quiet rhythm of patients recovering beneath white ceilings. Those memories already felt borrowed from another lifetime. Now every new sunrise carried only uncertainty. She wrapped trembling fingers around the small canvas satchel that held everything she still owned: a worn family photograph, a fountain pen without ink, and a folded Red Cross armband she had stopped wearing weeks earlier. Beside her, another woman leaned close enough that only Elsa could hear the words. "They say the guards are Jewish Americans." The sentence drifted through the line like a sudden gust of winter air. No one answered. They did not have to. Every face changed in exactly the same way. Eyes lowered, shoulders tightened. Someone quietly swallowed. Another woman began rubbing her thumb against the seam of her sleeve without realizing it. Rumors had traveled faster than trucks during the last weeks of the war. Entire convoys passed stories from one holding area to another. Some were true. Many were invented. All of them grew heavier with every mile. The newest rumor said that certain American units included soldiers whose families had suffered terribly across Europe. Some prisoners believed those men would never forgive. Others insisted forgiveness was impossible. Elsa did not know what to believe anymore. She only knew that history had become something too large for any single person to escape. Rainwater slipped from the edge of a watchtower roof, striking an empty steel bucket with slow, measured taps that echoed across the compound. Somewhere beyond the fence, an army truck idled quietly before its engine faded into silence. No shouted orders followed. No whistles pierced the air. The camp seemed almost unnaturally still, as though every person inside had agreed to wait for the same invisible moment. Elsa lifted her eyes for the first time that morning. Across the yard stood several American soldiers, speaking near a folding table covered with paperwork, enamel coffee mugs, and neatly stacked blankets protected beneath a canvas sheet. Steam drifted upward from one mug before disappearing into the cool air. One soldier removed his gloves, folded them carefully, and placed them beside a clipboard instead of tossing them aside. His movements were calm, practiced, almost ordinary. She could not see his face clearly from this distance, only the rain darkening his olive uniform and the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. Someone beside her whispered again, barely louder than breathing. "He's one of them." Elsa felt every lesson she had ever heard collide with everything she was seeing, and neither side seemed willing to surrender. The man finally stepped away from the folding table, just as the rain began to fade into a thin morning mist. His boots left dark prints across the wet ground, steady and unhurried, until he stopped several feet in front of the line of prisoners. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, not through them, not around them, at them. Elsa expected anger in his face. She searched for it almost instinctively. Instead, she found something harder to understand: fatigue, the kind carried by someone who had traveled much farther than the miles shown on any military map. The soldier unfolded a sheet of paper and spoke quietly to the interpreter standing beside him. His English carried the unmistakable rhythm of New York. The interpreter cleared his throat before translating into careful German. "My name is Sergeant Daniel Rosen. While you are here, you will follow camp regulations. You will receive food, shelter, medical attention if necessary, and work assignments when ordered. You are expected to obey the rules. We are expected to obey ours." No threats followed. No raised voice. Only silence settled across the yard once more. Elsa frowned almost without realizing it. She had prepared herself for harsh words. She had rehearsed apologies she never intended to speak. She had imagined humiliation because it seemed easier to prepare for cruelty than disappointment. Instead, she found procedure. Daniel folded the paper again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His eyes briefly rested on each woman before moving to the next, as though making certain every face had been acknowledged. He did not linger. He did not judge. He simply counted people instead of enemies. A young private approached carrying a clipboard. He whispered something to Daniel, who glanced toward the supply table. Daniel nodded once. The private hesitated, obviously surprised by the instruction he had just received, but turned without argument and disappeared toward one of the storage buildings. Elsa noticed another soldier watching from beneath the porch roof of the administration office. He folded his arms but said nothing. The entire camp seemed to be waiting for something that had not yet happened. A cold breeze crossed the open yard. One of the older German women began shivering so noticeably that the woman beside her quietly moved closer, trying to shield her from the wind without breaking formation. Daniel noticed. He looked toward the returning private, now struggling beneath an armful of thick olive-drab army blankets. Behind him came another soldier carrying a metal container that released thin streams of steam into the cool air. Elsa stared without understanding. The interpreter blinked twice, as though he also questioned what he was seeing. Daniel accepted one blanket himself instead of handing out orders from a distance. He walked to the oldest woman first. He stopped several feet away, giving her enough space to choose whether to step forward. When she remained frozen, he placed the folded blanket gently on a wooden crate beside her rather than directly into her hands. Then he stepped back. For the weather, the interpreter translated softly. Nothing more. No lecture. No demand for gratitude. Daniel repeated the same quiet gesture with every woman in the line. Folded blanket. Wooden crate. One careful step backward. By the time he reached Elsa, the steam from the nearby container carried the unmistakable scent of hot coffee across the damp morning air. She realized she had not smelled fresh coffee in many months. Daniel placed her blanket on the crate, looked at her for only a second, and gave a small, respectful nod before moving on. Elsa did not reach for it. None of the women did. They watched him walk away, each of them wondering whether kindness itself had become the greatest mystery they had encountered since the war began. The women remained exactly where they were long after the soldiers stepped away. The blankets rested untouched upon the wooden crates, collecting tiny drops of mist that shimmered beneath the pale morning light. No one wanted to be the first to believe what they had seen. Trust, once broken, did not return because of a single gesture. Elsa watched the steam continue to rise from the metal container near the supply table. Coffee. Real coffee. The familiar aroma drifted across the yard with the damp spring air, stirring memories she had tried to bury. Before the war, every Sunday morning had begun with the sound of her father grinding roasted beans in the family kitchen. She remembered sunlight falling across the breakfast table, the smell of fresh bread, her mother's quiet humming, and the certainty that ordinary days would last forever. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. A voice interrupted the silence. "You may take the blankets," the interpreter announced gently. "They are for you." No one moved. Daniel Rosen noticed immediately. He exchanged a brief glance with Private Samuel Klein, who stood beside the supply wagon holding several tin cups. Samuel looked almost as uncertain as the prisoners themselves. Daniel spoke quietly enough that only Samuel could hear him. Samuel nodded, picked up one of the cups, filled it from a steaming container, and handed it to Daniel. Instead of carrying it toward the women, Daniel lifted the cup to his own lips. He drank slowly, not to make a point, simply to remove doubt. Then he placed the cup on the same wooden crate where the blankets rested and stepped back once again. The interpreter smiled faintly before translating. "It is only coffee." The words sounded almost ordinary, yet they seemed to echo across the entire yard. Elsa looked at the cup without blinking. Around her, several women exchanged uncertain glances. One whispered that it could still be a test. Another quietly answered that tests usually came with shouting, not patience. The oldest woman in the group finally reached toward the blanket nearest her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the thick wool fabric and wrapped it around her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a brief moment as warmth settled over her. No one stopped her. Nothing happened. A younger prisoner slowly reached for another blanket. Then another. Within a minute, every woman held one except Elsa. Daniel did not encourage her. He did not even look in her direction. He simply turned toward the supply table and began reviewing paperwork with Lieutenant Thomas Miller as though the moment had already passed. That unexpected indifference unsettled Elsa more than any speech could have. If this had been an act, surely someone would have demanded gratitude by now. Instead, the soldiers returned to ordinary work. Pens scratched across forms. Boats crossed wet gravel. A truck engine started somewhere beyond the fence before fading into the distance. Life continued. Elsa lowered her eyes to the untouched blanket waiting beside her. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached forward and lifted it. The wool was heavier than she expected. Dry. Clean. It smelled faintly of soap instead of mildew. She pulled it around herself, feeling warmth spread across her shoulders against the cool morning air. For the first time since arriving at the camp, she looked toward Daniel without fear replacing curiosity. At almost the same moment, Daniel happened to glance across the yard. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat before he respectfully looked away first. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else. Yet Elsa understood something she could not explain. The man who had every reason to let history speak for him had chosen silence instead, and somehow that silence carried far greater weight than anger ever could. By late afternoon, the rain had disappeared, leaving behind cool air that carried the scent of damp pine and fresh earth across the camp. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds in narrow bands of gold, drying puddles one by one until the muddy yard reflected the sky instead of the storm. The prisoners were escorted to a long wooden mess hall where plain tables stood in careful rows beneath hanging light bulbs that had not yet been switched on. The room smelled of fresh bread, vegetable soup, brewed coffee, and clean pine boards. Elsa paused just inside the doorway. No one rushed toward the food. Hunger was familiar. Trust remained uncertain. The women stood together near the entrance, quietly watching the American kitchen staff move with calm efficiency. Metal ladles tapped against soup kettles. Ceramic mugs were arranged in perfect lines. Someone sliced loaves of bread into even portions with practiced hands. Everything felt strangely ordinary. Daniel Rosen entered a few moments later carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. He spoke briefly with the camp cook before walking toward the interpreter. "Tell them they may sit wherever they are comfortable," he said. "There are no assigned places." The interpreter repeated the message in German. Several women looked confused. One whispered that there had to be a catch. Another answered that perhaps the rules simply had not been explained yet. Elsa remained standing. Daniel noticed, but did not insist. Instead, he crossed the room to a nearby window and opened it slightly, allowing cool spring air to flow inside. Curtains moved gently in the breeze. Outside, birds had begun singing again after the morning rain. The simple sound felt almost unfamiliar. At last, the oldest woman stepped toward one of the tables. She sat carefully, leaving empty chairs between herself and everyone else. One by one, the others followed, until only Elsa remained standing beside the doorway. She watched Daniel sign several papers before placing the clipboard aside. Then, without saying a word, he walked to the serving counter. He accepted a bowl of soup from the cook, thanked him quietly, and carried it to an empty table near the window. Alone, he picked up a spoon and tasted the soup. Steam drifted upward between them. Bread rested beside the bowl. A plain white mug of coffee sat untouched near his hand. He ate slowly, reading a folded letter that had been waiting beside his place. There was no performance, no audience, only an ordinary meal at the end of a long day. Elsa realized something unexpected. If he had wished to frighten them, he would have watched every reaction. Instead, he seemed completely occupied with his own routine. After several minutes, Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. He stood, walked toward the serving counter again, and quietly spoke with the cook. Moments later, the cook began filling bowls for the prisoners. Fresh bread followed, then coffee. No one hurried them. No one counted bites. Elsa finally approached the counter when only a few women remained behind her. The cook smiled politely and placed a warm bowl into her hands. "Careful," he said. "It is hot." The interpreter translated automatically, but Elsa had already understood enough English to recognize the warning. She carried the bowl to an empty seat and simply looked at it. Carrots, potatoes, celery. Small pieces of chicken floated beneath the clear broth. Nothing extravagant, nothing theatrical, just food prepared with care. Across the room, Daniel happened to look up from his coffee. Their eyes met for a second time that day. He gave the slightest nod before returning to his letter. Elsa lowered her spoon into the warm broth. Around her, the room remained almost silent except for quiet conversation, clinking dishes, and the gentle sound of people discovering that even after years of suspicion, dignity could still arrive disguised as something as ordinary as supper. The next morning arrived wrapped in a layer of silver fog that drifted slowly between the barracks before the first rays of sunlight reached the camp. Dew clung to the grass beyond the fence, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed across the quiet countryside before fading into the stillness. The women were assigned simple maintenance duties after breakfast. Some swept wooden walkways. Others sorted blankets that had been washed the previous evening. Elsa found herself carrying medical supplies into a small clinic near the edge of the compound. The building was modest, little more than 2 rooms connected by a narrow hallway, but everything inside had been arranged with remarkable care. Glass jars stood neatly on wooden shelves. Bandages were stacked in perfect rows. A kettle rested on a small iron stove, releasing thin streams of steam that filled the room with comforting warmth. Elsa paused in the doorway without speaking. For the first time in months, she was standing inside a place that reminded her of the hospital where she had once worked. A young American medic looked up from a ledger and smiled politely. "Could you place those boxes over there, please?" he asked. The interpreter was not nearby, yet Elsa understood enough English to follow the request. She carefully carried the supplies to the indicated table and returned without making a sound. The medic thanked her before continuing his work. Nothing about the exchange felt extraordinary. Perhaps that was what made it unforgettable. Later that morning, an elderly German woman named Marta began coughing heavily while organizing folded linens. Elsa immediately noticed the exhaustion in the woman's face. Old habits returned before conscious thought. She crossed the room, touched Marta's forehead gently, then looked toward the shelves where medical instruments had been arranged. Daniel Rosen happened to enter at that exact moment, carrying several inventory forms. He stopped immediately when he saw Elsa examining Marta with quiet concentration. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Daniel looked from Elsa to the medic. "Does she know what she is doing?" he asked. The medic nodded without hesitation. "Better than I do, from what I have seen." Daniel studied Elsa for another brief moment before setting the paperwork aside. "Then let her help," he answered simply. There was no debate, no suspicion, just trust offered in the calmest possible way. Elsa carefully listened to Marta's breathing before asking for warm water and extra blankets. The medic handed her everything she requested. Together, they helped the older woman sit comfortably near the stove while fresh air entered through a cracked window. Within half an hour, Marta's breathing became easier, and color slowly returned to her cheeks. She smiled weakly before squeezing Elsa's hand with quiet gratitude. Daniel remained near the doorway the entire time, saying almost nothing. He watched the room with folded arms, not as someone searching for mistakes, but as someone observing professionals doing meaningful work. When everything had settled again, he stepped toward Elsa. She expected questions. Instead, he placed a small notebook on the table between them. "If medical supplies run low," he said slowly enough for her to understand, "write what is needed. We will find it." Elsa looked at the notebook without touching it. She had expected to be treated only as a prisoner. Instead, she was being remembered as a nurse. As Daniel turned to leave, sunlight finally broke through the clinic window, filling the room with warm morning light that rested across fresh bandages, polished glass bottles, and the quiet faces of people who, for one unexpected hour, had stopped seeing uniforms before they saw humanity. That evening, the sky turned the color of faded copper as the last sunlight settled across the rooftops of the camp. Long shadows stretched between the barracks, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut lumber from a nearby maintenance shed. Supper had ended nearly an hour earlier, yet the compound remained unusually quiet. Some prisoners wrote letters they were not certain would ever be delivered. Others simply sat outside, watching swallows circle above the open fields beyond the fence. Elsa remained inside the clinic, carefully reorganizing medical supplies that had arrived that afternoon. She counted bottles twice, aligned folded bandages by size, and sharpened 2 pencils with a small pocket knife she had borrowed from a medic. The work required concentration, and for the first time in many months, concentration felt more comforting than fear. A soft knock sounded against the open door. Daniel Rosen stepped inside, carrying a sealed cardboard carton marked with an American medical supply label. He placed it gently on the examination table without interrupting Elsa's work. "More gauze," he said, "and disinfectant." Elsa looked at the label before raising her eyes toward him. "Thank you," she answered carefully in English. The words came slowly but clearly. Daniel smiled politely, surprised less by the sentence than by the quiet confidence with which she spoke it. "Your English is improving," he replied. Elsa hesitated before answering. "I learned before the war. I never expected to use it like this." Daniel nodded once. "Neither did I." The room became still again. Outside, someone laughed near the mess hall. A baseball struck a leather glove with a sharp, familiar sound. Somewhere farther away, a radio played soft swing music that drifted through the evening air before fading beneath the chorus of crickets. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table. "You worked in a hospital?" he asked. Elsa looked down at the neatly folded bandages between her hands. "Yes, in Leipzig. Mostly surgical recovery and children's illnesses before everything changed." Daniel remained silent, allowing the sentence to settle naturally. After several moments, Elsa gathered enough courage to ask a question she had carried since the first morning. "May I ask something?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." Elsa searched carefully for the right words. "The women said you were Jewish." Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked toward the window where the last light of day rested against the glass. Finally he spoke. "Yes. Nothing more. No explanation. No defense." The simplicity of the answer somehow made it heavier. Elsa lowered her eyes. "Then why?" she whispered. Daniel understood the question, even though she never finished it. Why the blankets? Why the soup? Why the clinic? Why the respect? He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and slowly unfolded the same letter Elsa had seen during supper. The paper had already been opened many times. Its edges had become soft from repeated reading. He looked at it for only a second before folding it again. "My grandmother used to tell me something," he said quietly. "She believed that every person is tested sooner or later, not by what they suffer, but by what they choose after suffering." Elsa listened without moving. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. "I cannot change what happened before today. Neither can you. But I can decide what happens while you are here." Silence filled the room once more. Not an empty silence, one that carried the weight of choices instead of accusations. Elsa felt her throat tighten. She had spent weeks preparing herself to meet hatred. She had never prepared herself to meet restraint. As Daniel turned toward the door, he paused only long enough to place the folded notebook a little closer to Elsa's hand. "Tomorrow," he said, "write down everything the clinic still needs." Then he stepped outside into the fading light, leaving Elsa alone with fresh medical supplies, a quiet room, and a sentence that would remain with her far longer than the war itself. The following afternoon brought clear skies and warm sunshine that transformed the camp completely. Water still clung to the pine branches after the previous days of rain, but the paths had dried, and the muddy yard had become firm beneath every step. Work details moved quietly between buildings while trucks arrived with fresh supplies from a nearby army depot. The routine had settled into something almost predictable. Breakfast at sunrise. Assignments by 7 o'clock. Medical rounds before noon. Supper before sunset. Predictability did not erase uncertainty, but it slowly made fear surrender its place to observation. Elsa had filled nearly 3 pages of the small notebook Daniel had left behind. She listed bandages, antiseptic solution, sewing needles for repairing torn slings, clean towels, soap, and several medical textbooks that she knew would probably never be available. She hesitated before writing the final item. Children's fever thermometer. Then she smiled faintly at herself and crossed it out. There were no children here. Only adults trying to remember how to become ordinary people again. Near midday, she carried the notebook across the compound toward the administration office. The building stood beneath 2 large oak trees whose new spring leaves cast moving shadows across the wooden porch. Daniel was speaking with Lieutenant Thomas Miller while several soldiers unloaded crates nearby. As Elsa approached, another young soldier she had not seen before glanced toward the prisoners with visible frustration. He could not have been older than 23. His uniform still looked almost new. He watched Elsa walk toward the office, then quietly said something to Lieutenant Miller that she could not fully understand. She caught only a few words. Germans. Supplies. Why? Lieutenant Miller remained silent, but Daniel heard every word. He accepted the notebook from Elsa with a polite nod before turning toward the young soldier. His expression never changed. His voice remained calm enough that the unloading crews continued working without interruption. Walk with me, he said. The 2 men stepped several yards away beneath the oak trees. Elsa had no intention of listening, yet the afternoon breeze carried fragments of their conversation across the open yard. Sir, the young soldier said, after everything that happened, I do not understand why we keep giving them more than the regulations require. Daniel looked toward the distant fields before answering. Do you know what the regulations actually require? The soldier hesitated. Fair treatment. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Another quiet pause followed. Fair treatment is not generosity. It is discipline. The younger man lowered his eyes, but remained unconvinced. Daniel continued speaking in the same measured voice. The easiest thing in the world is to let pain make your decisions for you. He glanced toward the clinic where Elsa had spent the past several days working beside the American medic. The harder choice is remembering who you are before pain tells you who to become. The young soldier stood silently beneath the moving branches. Finally, he nodded once, not because every question had been answered, but because he understood the lesson was larger than the conversation itself. Daniel returned to the porch carrying Elsa's notebook. He opened it carefully, reading each handwritten line with complete attention. He never smiled, yet his expression softened when he reached the final page. Looking up, he said only 4 words. Good work, Nurse Reinhardt. The title stopped Elsa more completely than any compliment could have. For weeks she had answered only to prisoner numbers, transport lists, and quiet instructions. In a single sentence, someone had spoken the identity the war had almost erased. She accepted the notebook after Daniel finished reviewing it, and for the first time since crossing the camp gates, she stood a little straighter, not because the fence had disappeared, but because someone had reminded her that dignity could survive even where freedom had not yet returned. 3 days later, the camp no longer felt suspended between fear and uncertainty. It had found a quiet rhythm of its own. The mornings began with the smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall. The afternoons echoed with trucks arriving, tools striking wood, and conversations carried gently by the wind. Even the birds seemed less cautious now, gathering along the fence posts as though they had forgotten why the fences existed. Elsa noticed the change first in the women around her. They spoke more often. Someone laughed while folding laundry. Marta no longer coughed through the night. Another prisoner carefully planted small wildflowers beside the clinic steps, using an empty soup can as a flower pot. No one had ordered her to do it. She simply wanted something beautiful to survive the season. Late one afternoon, a supply truck stopped outside the clinic carrying several heavy wooden crates. Private Samuel Klein climbed down from the passenger seat, wiping dust from his sleeves before reading the inventory sheet. Most of the boxes contained medical supplies requested in Elsa's notebook. Glass bottles wrapped in paper, fresh gauze, soap, surgical thread. The final crate proved much heavier than expected. Samuel bent to lift one end, but lost his balance on the uneven ground. The crate slipped awkwardly, stopping before it struck the porch. Elsa stepped forward almost instinctively. "Together," she said. Samuel looked surprised for only a moment before nodding. Each of them lifted one side, carrying the crate carefully through the clinic doorway. They placed it gently on the floor without speaking another word. Daniel happened to witness the moment while crossing the yard with Lieutenant Thomas Miller. He paused, watching the quiet cooperation between an American soldier and a German nurse. Neither appeared uncomfortable. Neither seemed interested in proving anything. They were simply solving a practical problem. Lieutenant Miller smiled faintly. That would have been difficult to imagine a few months ago. Daniel looked toward the open clinic door where Samuel was already thanking Elsa before returning outside. "People usually surprise each other," Daniel answered. "Sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better." Before their conversation could continue, raised voices drifted across the compound from the maintenance shed. One of the civilian contractors delivering lumber had noticed Elsa helping inside the clinic. He frowned as Daniel approached. "She is still a prisoner," the man said. "Why let her work with medical supplies? Why trust her at all?" Several nearby soldiers looked up from their duties. Even Samuel stopped unloading crates. The entire yard grew unexpectedly quiet. Daniel did not answer immediately. He removed his work gloves, folded them neatly, and placed them on top of a wooden barrel beside him. Then he looked calmly at the contractor. "Because she is qualified." The man shook his head. "That is not what I asked." Daniel nodded. "I know." Another brief silence settled over the yard. The contractor folded his arms, waiting. Daniel spoke so evenly that no one had to lean closer to hear him. "Justice is not measured by how we treat our friends. It is measured by how we treat people after we have every reason not to." No one interrupted. Even the breeze seemed to pause beneath the oak trees. Daniel continued. "If we abandon our principles the moment they become difficult, then they were never principles at all. They were only conveniences." The contractor looked toward the clinic where Elsa stood quietly beside the stacked medical crates. He said nothing else. After a long moment, he simply adjusted his cap, returned to his truck, and continued unloading lumber without another complaint. Around the compound, work resumed almost exactly where it had stopped. Hammers struck nails. Boots crossed gravel. Someone laughed near the kitchen. Elsa remained standing inside the clinic doorway, unseen by most of the camp, yet unable to forget the words she had just heard. She realized that the greatest act of restraint was often invisible. It looked less like heroism and more like an ordinary man quietly refusing to surrender his character, even when history itself would have excused him for doing so. Weeks passed with the quiet certainty that only routine could create. Spring deepened across the countryside, covering the hills beyond the camp with fresh green leaves while wildflowers slowly appeared beside dusty roads and fence lines. The mornings no longer carried the sharp chill of April. Instead, they arrived with warm sunlight spilling across the barracks, birds singing before sunrise, and the familiar sound of coffee being poured into enamel mugs. Elsa often reached the clinic before anyone else. She would unlock the medicine cabinet, straighten the shelves, and open the windows to let the clean morning air drift through the room. The small flower pot beside the front steps had begun to bloom. Tiny blue blossoms leaned toward the light, reminding everyone who passed that life rarely asked permission before beginning again. One quiet afternoon, Lieutenant Thomas Miller entered the clinic carrying several official documents. He placed them carefully on the desk before looking at Elsa with a gentle expression. "Your transfer orders have arrived," he said. "You and the other women will be moved to another processing center next week." Elsa lowered the bandage she had been folding. She had known this day would eventually come, yet hearing the words made the room feel unexpectedly still. Camps were never meant to become permanent. Neither were the people who passed through them. News traveled quickly. By evening, the women quietly packed the few belongings they had collected during their stay. Folded blankets, letters, photographs, a few books. Marta carefully watered the small flowers one last time before leaving the watering can beside the porch. On the final morning, the trucks waited outside the gate beneath a bright blue sky. Soldiers checked paperwork while engines idled softly in the cool air. There were no dramatic speeches, no ceremonies, only ordinary departures handled with quiet efficiency. Elsa stood near the truck, holding the same small canvas satchel she had carried on the day she arrived. It felt slightly heavier now because one new item rested inside. The little notebook Daniel had given her. Every page had been filled, every supply request completed. She intended to keep it long after the paper itself had grown old. Daniel approached, carrying a folded clipboard beneath one arm. He stopped several feet away, exactly as he had on the first morning. Respectful distance. Calm posture. Nothing forced. The clinic is in better condition than when you found it, he said. Elsa smiled softly. It was never only mine. Daniel nodded. No, it never was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, soldiers loaded equipment, while birds crossed the clear morning sky overhead. Finally, Elsa reached into her satchel and removed a single folded sheet of paper. She held out carefully. Daniel accepted it without opening it immediately. "Read it later," she said. He inclined his head. "I will." The truck driver called for departure. Elsa climbed aboard and took one last look across the camp. She saw the clinic window standing open, the flower pot beside the steps, the oak trees moving gently in the breeze. Daniel remained where he was, raising one hand in a simple farewell before stepping back to allow the convoy to leave. Several hours later, during a quiet break beneath those same oak trees, Daniel unfolded the paper. Written in careful English were only a few lines. "When I arrived, I expected every face to remind me of guilt. Instead, one face reminded me of responsibility. You did not ask me to forget the past. You show me that the future is built by the choices made after it. Thank you for remembering that I was still a nurse before I remembered it myself." Daniel folded the letter slowly and placed it inside the same pocket that held his grandmother's note. He looked toward the empty clinic porch where the blue flowers continued, turning toward the afternoon sun. The war had changed countless lives, but not every victory was written into history books. Some remained hidden inside ordinary moments. A blanket placed quietly upon a crate. A bowl of warm soup shared without expectation. A notebook handed across a table. They had expected revenge. They discovered restraint. They had expected hatred. They witnessed justice. And neither side ever forgot the quiet day when dignity proved stronger than memory.